In the early 1800s, the young country of America was changing dramatically, and so too were the roles of women. Some began working for wages outside the home, others led reform movements working to improve the country, and the first fight for women's rights began. But just what did these new roles mean for women? Well, that's the treasure we're out to discover. I'm Dan Luer, and this is History for Little Humans. Before we get going, I just want to remind teachers and homeschool parents that there are lesson plans and resources that go with this episode on my website, historyforhumans.com, so you can go check that out. And now, our exploration question for today's episode is, how did women's roles transform during the antebellum era? And antebellum just refers to the decades that led up to the Civil War from about 1820 to 1850. And with that as our focus, shovels out because we got some history to dig. Now, it might sound crazy today, but in the 1800s, women had the legal status of children. They couldn't own property, enter into contracts, file for divorce, or even gain custody of their children. And they certainly could not vote or hold office. The home was traditionally the woman's sphere, but at this time, as more men began to work away from the house, the home took on a special significance. Women were expected to make the home a sanctuary from the troubles of the world. This was known as the Cult of Domesticity. It went along with the beliefs of the true woman or true womanhood. It rested on the values of piety, submissiveness, and domesticity, which pretty much meant that women should be gentle, obedient, and find total fulfillment in their roles as mothers and wives. But as most families in America were just struggling to survive, many women had no means to live up to this ideal. Sojourner Truth criticized this impossible standard, stating, "I have as much muscle as any man. I have plowed and reaped and husked and chopped and mowed. And can any man do more than that? And ain't I a woman?" And like Sojourner Truth, many women objected to this idea of the woman's sphere and sought greater opportunities outside the home. In 1814, the Lowell Mill opened in northern Massachusetts, revolutionizing textile manufacturing in the country. The Lowell Mill employed mostly young women and children from nearby farming towns. And it was promised that the work would not be undignifying to the young ladies. They would have clean dormitories to live in, safe working conditions, mandatory church service on Sundays, educational activities, and they would be under the strict moral supervision of chaperones. And the workers became known as factory girls, and they were mostly between 18 to 35 years old. In factories that started to span across the Northeast, these young women were a key part of the Industrial Revolution in America. And that brings us to our quiz flash from the past. How many hours would you guess these factory girls at Lowell normally worked each week? 30, 40, 60, or 70? Now, I know that many of you guys are exhausted after a 6-hour school day, but these factory girls worked 14-hour shifts with just a couple of short breaks, which brings it to 70 hours a week. Yikes. The work was arduous and often mind-numbing, and at the end of the week, they only earned a few dollars. Double yikes. And because of this, the women and girls began organizing and fighting back. They organized some of the first strikes and efforts to form unions in the country. But most factory girls left work upon marriage, heading to a domestic life, while other women began to fight for changes in reforming America. A religious revival movement known as the Second Great Awakening swept across the country in the early 1800s. The sermons sparked a fire in the hearts of thousands, but mostly it was middle-class women that were impacted by it. It left them with a crusading spirit that sought to uplift the moral failings and social ills in the country. Dorothea Dix led a movement to improve the treatment and care for the mentally ill. While teaching inmates in prison, she witnessed the inhumane and horrific treatment that was given to mentally ill patients and demanded change. Speaking to government officials, she said, "The present state of insane persons confined within this commonwealth, in cages, closets, cellars, stalls, pens, chained, naked, beaten with rods and lashed into obedience." Her efforts led to improvements in treatment for the mentally ill and hospitals and institutions to care for them. Women also fought heavily against devil rum. Excessive drinking caused numerous problems in the country, and especially for women and children at home. Women formed the American Temperance Society that had chapters across the country. They got many a men to sign pledges to not drink, and they fought to make many counties ban the sale of alcohol. But no reform movement became as important as the fight against slavery. Men and women, black and white, joined the abolitionist cause to end slavery. And that's going to be covered in great detail in our next episode, so check that out. But it was actually in the fight against slavery that the first fight for women's rights in America began. At the World Anti-Slavery Convention in London, a group of American abolitionist women were prohibited from participating. Among the shunned women were Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. It was there that they realized that women needed a movement of their own to stand up for their own rights, to become equal citizens in the country. Courageous women like Mott, Stanton, and Susan B. Anthony began challenging gender norms and age-old prejudices against women. In 1848, they organized the Seneca Falls Convention to demand women's rights. At the Seneca Falls Convention, women and some men met to discuss and debate how to fight for those rights and what their demands should be. Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote the Declaration of Sentiments that built on the ideals of the Declaration of Independence. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal." In the Declaration, they demanded rights to own property, child custody, and most shockingly, the right to vote. The convention received some support but was mostly mocked and ridiculed in the press. But the reformers fought on and didn't look back, though it would take several decades to achieve their goals. Looking back, women did not only transform their own roles, but their efforts transformed and improved the country. Even though most women remained in the home, and many happily so, others fought to not be confined to such a role. And the movement that they started at Seneca Falls and throughout this period really echo on today, because remember that history is the light that guides us forward. So thanks for learning some today. This has been History for Little Humans.